Husband cheated on his pregnant wife with his boss's daughter, but she revealed a secret in court. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Upper East Side apartment, casting long shadows across the marble kitchen countertops. Isla Collins stood at the breakfast bar, her hand resting protectively over the subtle padding beneath her loose-fitting sweater. To anyone watching, she appeared to be a glowing, expectant mother at 3 months pregnant. The reality was far more calculated. "Morning sickness again?" David asked without looking up from his phone, his tone carrying the practiced concern of a husband who had perfected the art of appearing caring while being utterly detached. Isla clutched the edge of the sink, letting out a soft groan. "It's getting worse," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to sell the performance. "Dr. Morrison says it's normal, but—" David's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She caught it. That flash of irritation he tried to hide whenever her supposed pregnancy inconvenienced his carefully orchestrated schedule. For 3 months now, Isla had been watching, learning, documenting every micro-expression, every lie, every moment when his mask slipped. She had started the pregnancy charade almost immediately after discovering the first signs of his infidelity. "Maybe you should rest today," he said, finally glancing up. His dark eyes held no warmth, only the cold calculation of a man already planning his escape. "I'll be working late again. The Hayes account is demanding everything we've got." The Hayes account. Karen Hayes, the 24-year-old daughter of his boss, Richard Hayes, CEO of Meridian Tech Solutions. Isla's stomach churned, not from morning sickness, but from the bitter taste of knowing exactly where her husband would be spending his evening. "Of course," Isla murmured, lowering her eyes in what appeared to be resigned acceptance. "I understand how important this is for your career." David's phone buzzed. A text message. Even from across the kitchen, Isla could see the sender's name, K. Hayes. She watched as his fingers moved quickly across the screen, typing a response with the urgency of a man desperate to maintain 2 separate lives. "I should get going," he said, straightening his Armani tie, the same tie she had given him for their 5th wedding anniversary. "Big presentation today." He moved toward her, and for a moment, Isla wondered if he might actually kiss her goodbye like he used to. Instead, he placed a perfunctory hand on her shoulder, the gesture feeling more like a pat one might give a household pet. "Take care of yourself," he said. "And the baby." The baby. If only he knew how much truth lay hidden in that simple phrase. After David left, Isla waited exactly 15 minutes before moving to the walk-in closet they shared. Behind her winter coats, hidden in a shoebox marked Christmas decorations, lay her real treasure, a small digital recording device, 2 burner phones, and a manila folder thick with photographs, text message screenshots, and hotel receipts. She pulled out the latest addition to her collection, photos taken just 3 nights ago outside the Meridian Building's executive parking garage. David and Karen, pressed against his BMW, their bodies intertwined in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. In one particularly damning shot, Karen's hand was clearly visible on David's chest, her engagement ring, not from David, but from some other poor soul, catching the light from the street lamp above. Isla's phone rang, jarring her from her thoughts. The caller ID showed her sister's name, Melody. "Hey, how are you feeling?" Melody's voice was warm with genuine concern. "How's my little niece or nephew doing?" The guilt hit Isla like a physical blow. Melody had been knitting baby blankets, planning shower themes, even volunteering to be the birth coach. Everyone in their family believed the pregnancy was real, because Isla had needed witnesses, people who would remember her supposed condition when the time came for truth. "We're hanging in there," Isla said, her hand unconsciously moving to her padded belly. "Doctor says everything looks good. I'm so excited. Mom called this morning. She's already planning to fly in from Seattle for the birth. She wants to make sure she's here for her first grandchild." Isla closed her eyes, leaning against the closet wall. The web of lies was becoming more complex every day, but she couldn't stop now. Not when she was so close to having everything she needed. "Mel, can I ask you something?" Isla's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Of course, what's wrong? If you discovered something about someone you love, something that would destroy everything you thought you knew about them, would you want to know the truth, even if it hurt?" Silence stretched between them for a long moment. When Melody finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "Isla, is everything okay with David? You've been asking strange questions lately. I'm just... pregnancy hormones, I guess, making me overthink everything." You know you can talk to me about anything, right? If David is, he's fine. Isla cut her off quickly. We're fine. I'm just being paranoid. After ending the call, Isla returned to her evidence collection. She pulled out a small leather notebook and flipped to a page marked timeline. Every entry was meticulously dated and detailed. March 15th, David claims client dinner. Returns home at 1:47 a.m. smelling of unfamiliar perfume. March 22nd, finds receipt for romantic dinner at Le Bernardin. Never took me there. March 28th, overhears phone call. I can't wait to be with you properly. Background music matches Karen's Instagram story from same time. April 3rd, discovers second phone hidden in his gym bag. The list went on for pages. Months of careful observation, of playing the role of the trusting wife while systematically gathering ammunition for the war she knew was coming. Her laptop chimed with a new email notification. The sender made her blood run cold. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, Reproductive Endocrinology Associates of Manhattan. Mrs. Collins, the additional medical records you requested regarding your husband's previous fertility consultations have been located in our archives. Please call to schedule an appointment to review these confidential documents. As discussed, this information may be relevant to your current legal consultation. Best regards, Dr. Patricia Hendricks. Isla's hands trembled as she closed the laptop. The final piece of her puzzle was falling into place. Soon, very soon, David would learn what it meant to underestimate the woman he had chosen to betray. Outside their apartment window, Manhattan hummed with its usual energy. Millions of people going about their lives, unaware that in one corner of the Upper East Side, a woman was methodically preparing to detonate the foundation of two people's carefully constructed lies. Sheila looked at her reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusting the padding beneath her sweater one more time. The masquerade would continue a little longer, but when the curtain finally fell, David and Karen would discover that they had been playing their parts in a drama where someone else had always been directing the final act. The stage was nearly set. Soon it would be time for the performance of their lives. The 47th floor of the Meridian Tower gleamed with corporate sophistication, polished steel, imported marble, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Manhattan's financial district. David Collins straightened his shoulders as he stepped off the private elevator, knowing that today's performance would require every ounce of his considerable charm. "Good morning, Mr. Collins," chirped Rebecca, the young receptionist, whose eager smile had once flattered his ego. Now it simply reminded him how easily people could be manipulated with the right combination of authority and attention. "Morning, Rebecca. Is Mr. Hayes in yet?" "He's in the executive conference room with the board, but Miss Hayes asked me to tell you she's waiting in your office." David's pulse quickened. Karen waiting in his office meant she had something planned, something that would test his ability to maintain their carefully constructed facade in broad daylight, mere floors below her father's watchful domain. He found her perched on the edge of his mahogany desk, wearing a form-fitting black dress that left little to the imagination. Her honey-blonde hair cascaded over one shoulder, and her green eyes sparkled with the kind of mischief that had first drawn him into her web 6 months ago. "Close the door," she purred, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything in her 24 years of privileged existence. David glanced toward the glass wall that separated his office from the bustling workspace beyond. "Karen, we talked about this." "Not here. Relax," she said, sliding off the desk and moving toward him with predatory grace. "Daddy's tied up with the Singapore acquisition all morning. Besides, I have news." She pressed something into his hand, a small white envelope with his name written in her distinctive looping script. David's stomach clenched. Karen's surprises had a tendency to complicate his already precarious situation. "What is this?" "Open it." Inside was an ultrasound image, black and white, grainy but unmistakably showing the curved shape of a developing fetus. Written at the bottom in medical notation, "Baby Hayes, 8 weeks, 2 days." David stared at the image, his mind racing through calculations. 8 weeks, 2 months. Right around the time Karen had started visiting his apartment when Isla was at her weekly book club meetings. "Congratulations, Daddy," Karen whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. "We're going to be a real family soon." The irony wasn't lost on him. While his wife faked a pregnancy at home, his mistress was carrying what she believed to be his child. The situation would have been laughable if it weren't so catastrophically complicated. "Karen, this is..." He struggled for words that wouldn't reveal the growing panic in his chest. "This changes everything." I know, she said, misinterpreting his shock as joy. I've already been thinking about names. For a boy, maybe something strong like Alexander or Christopher. For a girl, perhaps Sophia or, have you told your father? The question came out sharper than he intended. Karen's expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. Not yet. I wanted to tell you first. But David, we can't keep this secret much longer. People will start to notice, and I won't hide our child like some shameful secret. Through the glass wall, David watched his colleagues going about their morning routines, answering emails, preparing presentations, living their simple, uncomplicated lives. He envied them their problems. Quarterly reports, client deadlines, office politics. Nothing compared to the house of cards he had built around himself. We need to be smart about this, he said, his executive training kicking in. Strategic. Your father's position, my marriage, your marriage to that pathetic little mouse? Karen's voice dripped with disdain. David, she's nothing. A forgettable nobody who got lucky enough to marry up. When Daddy finds out about the baby, he'll understand. Family comes first in the Hayes household. David flinched at her casual cruelty toward Isla. Whatever his faults, whatever mistakes he had made, Isla had never deserved the venom in Karen's voice. She had been a good wife, supportive, trusting, perhaps too trusting for her own good. Isla is 6 months pregnant, he reminded Karen, though the words felt strange on his tongue. I can't just abandon her now. Karen laughed, a sound like crystal breaking. Oh, David, you're such a man sometimes. Always thinking you have to be the noble hero. She traced a finger along his jawline. Leave the details to me. I know exactly how to handle the mouse. Before David could ask what she meant, his phone buzzed with an intercom message from Rebecca. Mr. Hayes wants to see you in his office immediately. Karen straightened, smoothing her dress. That's my cue to disappear, but David, she leaned close enough that he could smell her expensive perfume. Don't make me wait too long to go public with this. Our child deserves better than secrets and shadows. After she left, David sat heavily in his leather chair, staring at the ultrasound image. Outside his window, the city sprawled endlessly in all directions. Millions of people living their lives, making their choices, facing their consequences. He had always believed he was smarter than most of them, more capable of controlling outcomes, managing variables. Now he wondered if he had simply been lucky for too long. His phone rang. The caller ID made his blood freeze. Isla, home. Hello? David? Isla's voice sounded small, fragile. I'm sorry to bother you at work, but something happened. I started spotting this morning, and Dr. Morrison wants to see me right away. For a moment, David felt genuine concern pierce through his self-absorption. Whatever his feelings about their marriage, the thought of Isla suffering alone while he played games with Karen made him feel like the worst kind of person. Do you need me to come with you? The offer surprised him even as he made it. No, I know how important today is for you. The Hayes presentation. I don't want to interfere with your career. The irony was suffocating. His career, his affair, his lies, all tangled together into a web that seemed to tighten around his throat with every breath. Isla, I'll call you after the appointment, she said quickly. I love you, David. I know we haven't been as close lately, but I want you to know that you and this baby are the most important things in my life. The line went dead. David stared at his phone, then at the ultrasound image still lying on his desk. In the space of 10 minutes, he had been confronted with one pregnancy that threatened his future, and another that reminded him of everything he had already lost. A knock on his office door interrupted his spiral of guilt and panic. Through the glass, he saw Richard Hayes himself, 62 years old, silver-haired, and radiating the kind of authority that came from building a billion-dollar empire from nothing. David, we need to talk. As his boss entered the office, David quickly slipped the ultrasound image into his desk drawer, but not before noticing that Richard's usual warm demeanor had been replaced by something much colder, much more calculating. Close the door, Richard said, his voice carrying the quiet menace of a man who had just discovered something that displeased him greatly. David's hands trembled slightly as he turned the lock. Outside, the Manhattan morning continued its relentless pace, but inside his office, time seemed to slow to a crawl as two men prepared for a conversation that would change everything. Richard Hayes moved through David's office with the measured steps of a predator circling its prey. His steel-gray eyes swept across the room, taking in every detail. The family photo on David's desk, Isla smiling radiantly at their wedding, the corporate awards lining the walls, the carefully maintained facade of a successful executive's life. 15 years, Richard said finally, settling into the chair across from David's desk. That's how long I've been watching young executives climb the ladder in this company. Some make it, some don't. The difference is always the same thing. David forced himself to maintain eye contact, though every instinct screamed at him to look away. What's that, sir? Judgment. Richard leaned back, his fingers steepled. The ability to understand that every action has consequences, and some consequences can destroy not just careers but entire lives. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. David could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel sweat beginning to form along his collar despite the office's perfect climate control. I received an interesting call this morning, Richard continued conversationally. From my wife, Martha. Seems she ran into your wife yesterday at Bergdorf's. Isla was shopping for maternity clothes, glowing with that particular happiness expectant mothers have. David nodded carefully. Yes, sir. We're very excited about the baby. I'm sure you are. Richard's smile was razor thin. Martha mentioned how lovely Isla looked, how she's carrying so beautifully at 6 months. Funny thing about pregnancy, David. My late mother always said you could tell a woman's story just by watching how she carries herself when she's expecting. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. David gripped the arms of his chair, trying to project calm, while his mind raced through possible escape routes from this conversation. Martha's had 3 children, you know, Richard continued. She's what you might call an expert on the subject, very observant about these things. In fact, she was so impressed with Isla's composure that she mentioned it to Karen when my daughter stopped by for dinner last night. David's blood turned to ice. Karen was at dinner? Oh yes, family dinner. We have them every Sunday. A Hayes tradition. Karen seemed distracted, kept checking her phone, making excuses to step away from the table. Very unlike her usual behavior. Richard's eyes never left David's face. When Martha brought up your wife's pregnancy, Karen had the most interesting reaction. The walls of the office seemed to be closing in. David could barely form words. What kind of reaction? She laughed. Richard's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Not a polite laugh, mind you. Something much more knowing. When Martha asked what was so funny, Karen said, and I quote, "Some pregnancies are more real than others." David felt the floor give way beneath him. In that moment, he understood that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse entirely. Now, David, I'm a businessman. I've built this company by paying attention to details, by understanding when people are telling me the truth and when they're not. So when my daughter makes cryptic comments about pregnancies while simultaneously acting like a woman with secrets of her own, Richard stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the city. Well, it makes an old man start asking uncomfortable questions. Mr. Hayes, I think there might be some misunderstanding. Stop. The word cut through the air like a blade. Richard turned back to face him, and David saw something in his expression that made his blood run cold. This wasn't just a boss addressing an employee. This was a father who suspected someone was playing games with his daughter. I've been in this business for 40 years, David. I've seen every kind of corporate scandal, every type of personal drama that can destroy a company's reputation. But you know what I've never tolerated? Men who think they can use my family as stepping stones for their own ambitions. David's mouth went dry. Sir, I would never. Karen is pregnant. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Richard's expression remained perfectly controlled, but David could see the fury burning behind his eyes. She told me this morning, very excited, very proud. Seems she's been seeing someone for several months now. Someone she's apparently quite serious about. Someone she believes loves her. Richard moved closer to David's desk. When I asked about the father, she became evasive, said I'd meet him soon, that he just needed to handle some personal business first. David felt like he was drowning in plain sight. Every word from Richard's mouth tightened the noose around his neck. Here's what I know, David. I know my daughter has been spending time in this building outside of normal business hours. I know you've been working late most nights for the past several months. I know Karen has developed a sudden interest in the projects you're managing. Richard placed both hands on David's desk, leaning forward. And I know that if any employee in this company is taking advantage of my daughter's youth and inexperience, that employee will discover exactly how far a father will go to protect his child. The threat wasn't subtle. It wasn't meant to be. Mr. Hayes, I understand your concern, but do you? Richard straightened. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're juggling quite a few balls in the air. A pregnant wife at home, Late nights at the office and my daughter making mysterious comments about other people's pregnancies. He paused. That's a lot of variables for one man to manage, David. History suggests that when men try to control too many variables at once, everything eventually falls apart. David's phone buzzed with a text message. Despite his better judgment, he glanced at the screen. It was from Karen. Can't wait to tell Daddy about us tonight. Time to stop hiding. Richard noticed his reaction. Important message? Just client follow-up. I see. Richard moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. David, I'm going to give you some advice. Free of charge. From someone who's seen talented young men destroy themselves over much less complicated situations than the one you appear to be in. David waited, barely breathing. Whatever games you think you're playing, whatever lies you think you can maintain, whatever consequences you think you can avoid, you're wrong. Truth has a way of surfacing, usually at the worst possible moment for everyone involved. Richard opened the door. I suggest you figure out very quickly what kind of man you want to be when that moment comes. After Richard left, David sat alone in his office, staring at Karen's text message. Through his window, he could see people walking the streets below. Anonymous figures living anonymous lives, free from the web of deception that was slowly strangling him. His phone rang again. This time it was Isla. David? The doctor wants to run some additional tests. He's concerned about complications. Can you meet me at the hospital? As David looked at the ultrasound image hidden in his desk drawer, then at Karen's threatening text message, then at the door through which Richard Hayes had just delivered his warning, he realized that every choice he had made over the past 6 months had led him to this moment, the moment when all his lies would finally demand their payment. I'll be right there, he told Isla, though he knew that by the time this day ended there might be no safe place left for him to run. Mount Sinai Hospital's obstetrics wing buzzed with the controlled chaos of life beginning and ending in equal measure. David hurried through the sterile corridors, his designer shoes clicking against polished linoleum as he searched for room 314, where Isla was supposedly undergoing emergency tests. He found her in a private room, sitting on the edge of the examination bed wearing a hospital gown, her face pale with what appeared to be genuine distress. For a moment, guilt overwhelmed him. Whatever his sins, seeing his wife in apparent medical crisis reminded him of the man he used to be before ambition and temptation had corrupted his judgment. How are you feeling? He asked, moving to her side with what he hoped looked like genuine concern. Scared, Isla whispered, her hand moving protectively to her padded belly. Dr. Morrison ran some blood work and there were irregularities. He wants to do an ultrasound to make sure the baby is okay. David's stomach clenched. An ultrasound would expose everything. The elaborate charade, the fake pregnancy, the months of careful deception. But as he looked at Isla's face, he saw something that made his blood run cold. She wasn't afraid of being discovered. She was planning something. Where is Dr. Morrison now? David asked. He'll be back shortly. He's consulting with a specialist. Isla's voice was steady despite her apparent distress. David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Every alarm bell in David's mind started ringing simultaneously. Of course. What is it? If something happens to this baby, if we lose, she paused, her eyes filling with tears that looked disturbingly real. Would you still want to stay married to me? The question hit him like a physical blow, not because of its emotional weight, but because of its implications. Isla was giving him an out, a graceful exit from their marriage that wouldn't make him look like the villain. It was almost too convenient, too perfectly timed with his current crisis. Why would you ask that? He said carefully. Because I see how you look at me lately. Like I'm a burden, an obligation. Like you're somewhere else even when you're here. Isla's voice broke slightly. I know you've been working late, staying away from home. I know things have been difficult between us. David felt a strange combination of relief and suspicion. If Isla was offering him a divorce, it would solve half his problems. He could leave her, marry Karen, start fresh with his boss's blessing. But something in her demeanor, the careful way she chose her words, the timing of this conversation, made him wonder if he was walking into a trap. Isla, you're carrying our child. Nothing else matters right now. She smiled sadly. Our child. Yes, that's what makes this so complicated. Before David could ask what she meant, the door opened. A tall man in his 50s wearing a white coat entered, followed by a younger woman with a clipboard. Mrs. Collins, I'm Dr. Morrison. Thank you for coming in so quickly. He turned to David. And you must be the father. I'm glad you could be here for this. Is everything okay with the baby? David asked, playing his role as the concerned husband. Dr. Morrison exchanged a glance with his colleague. That's what we're here to determine. Mrs. Collins, if you could lie back, we'll start with the ultrasound. As Isla positioned herself on the examination bed, David noticed something odd. The medical equipment in the room was state-of-the-art, but there was something too perfect about the setup, like a stage carefully prepared for a performance. Mr. Collins, Dr. Morrison said as he prepared the ultrasound machine, your wife mentioned that this pregnancy was planned, that you've been trying for a while. Yes, David replied automatically. We've wanted a family for years. Interesting. Dr. Morrison began applying gel to Isla's exposed belly, because according to the medical records I've reviewed, that might have been more challenging than you realized. David's heart stopped. What do you mean? Well, without getting into too much detail in front of your wife, there are some historical medical factors that we need to discuss. Perhaps we could speak privately after the examination? The ultrasound screen flickered to life, and David found himself staring at a clear, detailed image of what was unmistakably a developing fetus. For a moment, confusion overwhelmed him. If this was Isla's ultrasound, if she really was pregnant, then everything he thought he knew was wrong. Wait, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't understand. Dr. Morrison paused, looking between David and Isla with growing concern. Mr. Collins, is everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Isla sat up slowly, and David watched as she reached beneath her hospital gown and pulled out what was unmistakably a pregnancy pad, the kind used by actors in theater productions. The baby bump that had defined their lives for 6 months was nothing more than carefully constructed padding. Actually, Dr. Morrison, Isla said, her voice suddenly stronger, more controlled, I think it's time we discussed those medical records you mentioned, the ones about my husband's fertility issues. David felt the room spin around him. What medical records? Dr. Morrison, who David now realized was indeed the actual fertility specialist who had conducted his medical evaluations years earlier, pulled out a thick manila folder. The records from your consultation at Reproductive Endocrinology Associates of Manhattan, from 5 years ago. I never went to any fertility clinic, David said desperately. No? Isla's voice was ice-cold now. Then how do you explain these comprehensive test results showing that you've been clinically sterile for over 8 years? She handed him a set of medical documents, each page stamped and notarized, each signature authentic. David's hands shook as he read his own name on fertility tests he had never taken, results that showed conclusively that he was incapable of fathering children. This is impossible, he whispered. Is it? Isla stood up, no longer playing the role of the frightened pregnant wife. Or is it impossible that you never noticed? Never questioned why we never had children despite years of trying? Never wondered why I suddenly became pregnant right around the time you started staying late at the office with your boss's daughter? The room felt like it was collapsing around him. How did you get these records? It's amazing what you can discover when you hire the right private investigator. Even more amazing what medical professionals will tell you when you present yourself as a concerned wife, trying to understand why fertility treatments aren't working. David sank into a chair, the weight of his exposure crushing him. The pregnancy, the morning sickness, the doctor visits, all theater. Isla's voice carried no triumph, only cold satisfaction. 6 months of performance art, designed to give you enough rope to hang yourself. And David, you've been very thorough about tying the knot. His phone buzzed. Another text from Karen. Told Daddy. He's so excited to meet you. Dinner tonight at 7. Don't be late. Isla glanced at his phone screen and smiled. The first genuine smile David had seen from her in months. Oh good, she said pleasantly. I was worried we might run out of time before your girlfriend made her big announcement. This way, when Richard Hayes discovers that his daughter's baby can't possibly be yours, you'll already be here at the hospital. Very convenient for everyone involved. David looked up at her, and for the first time in their 8-year marriage, he saw his wife clearly. Not the naive, trusting woman he had taken for granted, but someone far more intelligent, far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. What do you want? He asked quietly. Isla gathered the medical records, her movements efficient and practiced. What do I want? David, I want you to go to dinner with the Hayes family tonight. I want you to sit at their table, look Richard Hayes in the eye, and explain how you managed to get his daughter pregnant when medical science says it's impossible. She moved toward the door, then paused. And then, David, I want you to come home and explain to me how you thought you could build a future on a foundation of lies when you were too stupid to realize that your own body had already exposed every single one of them." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving David alone in the real medical consultation room with the devastating truth of his own biological limitations and the crushing realization that his wife had orchestrated the perfect revenge using legitimate medical professionals and authentic documentation. The Hayes estate in the Hamptons sprawled across 15 acres of perfectly manicured grounds, its colonial architecture speaking to old money and older power. David sat in his BMW outside the wrought iron gates, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Every instinct screamed at him to drive away, to disappear into the night and never look back. But Karen's increasingly frantic text made it clear that escape was no longer an option. "Where are you? Daddy is so excited to meet his future son-in-law, don't embarrass me. David, I'm serious. Get here now. If you don't show up, I'm calling Isla myself." The final threat was what ultimately forced his hand. Whatever happened tonight, he needed to control the narrative, to find some way to minimize the catastrophic damage that was about to unfold. The front door opened before he could even ring the bell. Karen stood there in a flowing emerald dress that accentuated her pregnancy glow, her face radiant with excitement and anticipation. For a moment, David almost felt sorry for her. She was about to learn the same devastating truth that had just destroyed his own carefully constructed world. "Finally," she said, pulling him inside and kissing him with an enthusiasm that felt like acid on his lips. "I was starting to think you got cold feet." The Hayes family dining room felt like a courtroom where the verdict had already been decided. David sat across from Richard and Martha Hayes, while Karen remained conspicuously absent. She had been advised by her father to stay away until David's explanations were complete. Richard Hayes stood at the head of the table, wearing a navy blazer and khakis that somehow managed to look both casual and authoritative. His wife Martha was an elegant woman in her late 50s, her silver hair styled perfectly, her smile warm but appraising as she studied David with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating her daughter's suitors. "David!" Richard's voice boomed across the room with apparent delight. "So good to see you outside the office. Martha, this is the young man I've been telling you about, one of our brightest executives." Martha extended her hand gracefully. "It's lovely to meet you, David. Karen has told us so much about you." The irony was suffocating. David shook her hand, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack his face. "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Hayes. You have a beautiful home." "Thank you. We've been looking forward to this evening for quite some time." Martha's eyes twinkled with what David now recognized as dangerous knowledge. "Karen has been so mysterious about her personal life lately. We're thrilled she's finally decided to share her happiness with the family." Karen practically glowed as she took David's arm, leading him to his seat at the table. "I wanted tonight to be perfect," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "This is the most important dinner of my life." As they settled into their chairs, David noticed that Richard's demeanor had subtly shifted. The warmth was still there, but underneath it was something else, the coiled tension of a predator preparing to strike. This wasn't a celebration dinner. It was an interrogation disguised as a family meal. "So, David," Martha said as the first course arrived, a delicate seafood bisque that David couldn't even pretend to taste. "Karen tells us you've been married for 8 years. That's wonderful. Isla, isn't it?" "Yes." David's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. 8 years, Richard mused, swirling his wineglass thoughtfully. "That's a significant commitment. Must be difficult to balance career ambitions with family obligations." Karen's hand found David's under the table, squeezing reassuringly. She had no idea that every word from her parents was driving the knife deeper into his chest. "Speaking of family," Karen said, her excitement bubbling over, "Daddy, Mom, there's something David and I need to tell you." Martha clasped her hands together, feigning surprise. "Oh my goodness, what is it, darling?" Karen stood up, one hand resting on her still small bump, her face radiant with joy. "We're having a baby." The silence that followed was deafening. Martha's expression of delighted surprise was so perfectly crafted that David almost believed it was genuine. Richard simply stared at his daughter, his face unreadable. "A baby," Richard said slowly. "How wonderful." "I know it's complicated," Karen rushed on, misinterpreting her father's tone, "with David's current situation and everything. But we love each other and love finds a way, right?" Martha reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. "Of course it does, sweetheart. Love always finds a way." Her eyes locked with David's. Doesn't it, David? Mrs. Hayes, When are you due? Richard interrupted, his business voice cutting through the emotional moment like a scalpel. The doctor says mid-December, Karen replied happily. Right around Christmas. Can you imagine? The perfect gift for the whole family. Richard pulled out his phone and began tapping on the calculator app. David watched in growing horror as his boss performed the simple arithmetic that would expose everything. Mid-December, Richard repeated. So conception would have been around mid-March, early April? Something like that, Karen said, though a note of uncertainty had crept into her voice. Why does it matter? Oh, it doesn't matter to me, Richard said pleasantly, but it might matter to David's wife, especially since I believe she's also expecting around the same time frame. Karen's face went white. What? Martha leaned forward with apparent concern. Oh dear, did we say something wrong? Karen, darling, you look pale. David. Karen's voice was barely audible. What is he talking about? David felt like he was drowning in quicksand. Every word he spoke would only pull him deeper, but silence was no longer an option. Isla is pregnant, he said quietly. Pregnant? Karen's voice rose to a pitch that made the crystal glasses ring. But you told me she couldn't, that you two had been trying for years. Richard's laugh was cold and humorless. Oh, I think there's been quite a few things David hasn't told you, Princess. Just like there are quite a few things you apparently haven't told us. Martha stood gracefully, beginning to clear the soup bowls with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been expecting this exact conversation. Richard, perhaps we should let the young people sort this out themselves. No, Richard's voice carried absolute authority. I think it's time for some honesty at this table. David, why don't you explain to my daughter how a man can father 2 children with 2 different women at exactly the same time? Karen turned to face David, her green eyes wide with confusion and growing panic. David, tell them they're wrong. Tell them about us, about our plans. David looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the sophisticated woman who had seduced him with promises of power and passion, but a young girl who had believed the lies of a man old enough to know better. The guilt was overwhelming. Karen, he said softly, there's something you need to know about the baby you're carrying. What about it? Richard answered before David could speak. It's not his. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Karen's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally, dawning horror. That's impossible, she whispered. Martha returned from the kitchen carrying a manila folder that David recognized with sick certainty. I'm afraid it's not only possible, dear. It's medically documented. She placed the folder in front of Karen, who opened it with trembling hands. David watched as she read the same fertility reports that had destroyed his world just hours earlier. I don't understand, Karen said, her voice breaking. This says David is sterile, that he's been sterile for 8 years. Which means, Richard said with quiet finality, that whoever fathered your child, it wasn't the married man you've been sneaking around with for the past 6 months. Karen looked up at David, tears streaming down her face. You knew, didn't you? You knew this whole time that we couldn't. David couldn't meet her eyes. Karen, you let me believe. Her voice cracked like a whip. You let me think we were building something real, something special. You let me fall in love with you knowing that everything you told me was a lie. Richard stood up slowly, his imposing frame casting a shadow across the table. David, I think it's time for you to leave my house, and tomorrow morning I think it's time for you to find a new job. As David stumbled toward the door, Karen's sobs echoing behind him, he realized that Isla had orchestrated the perfect revenge. She hadn't just exposed his affair. She had engineered a situation where his lies would destroy themselves, where the truth would emerge not from her accusations, but from simple biological impossibility. Outside in the cool October air, David sat in his car and stared at the Hayes mansion, knowing that inside a young woman was learning the same devastating lesson he had learned that afternoon, that some lies are so fundamental, so complete, that when they finally collapse, they take everything else down with them. His phone buzzed with a text from Isla. How was dinner? For the first time in months, David told his wife the complete truth. It's over. Everything is over. The Upper East Side apartment that had once been David's sanctuary now felt like a mausoleum. He stood in the doorway at 11:47 p.m., his expensive suit wrinkled, his face hollow with the exhaustion of a man who had watched his entire life collapse in the span of a single evening. The living room was dimly lit by a single table lamp, and there, Sitting calmly on their cream-colored sofa was Isla. She had changed out of her hospital clothes into a simple black dress that somehow made her look both elegant and formidable. A glass of red wine sat on the coffee table beside her, next to a neat stack of legal documents that David recognized with sinking dread. "You waited up," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from hours of Karen's hysterical phone calls and Richard Hayes's cold dismissal. "I wanted to see your face when you came home," Isla replied, her tone conversational, almost pleasant. "To see if you'd finally learned the difference between consequences and surprises." David moved into the room like a man walking to his execution. "Isla, we need to talk." "Do we?" She took a delicate sip of her wine. "I think everything that needed to be said was said months ago. You just weren't listening." He sank into the armchair across from her, the weight of his failures pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. "How long have you known? About your affair with Karen?" "Since the second week." Isla's answer was matter-of-fact, delivered without anger or pain, which somehow made it more devastating than if she had screamed at him. "About your sterility. I suspected for years, but I had it confirmed 3 months ago." 3 months. David rubbed his face with his hands. "Jesus, Isla. 3 months of, why didn't you just confront me?" "Because confrontation would have given you the opportunity to lie, to manipulate, to find a way to make this my fault." She set down her wineglass with deliberate precision. "I wanted you to hang yourself, David, and you did such a thorough job of it." The apartment felt suffocating. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan sparkled with late-night energy. Millions of people living their uncomplicated lives, while his own world burned around him. "Karen called me 17 times on the drive home," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Screaming, crying, demanding answers I don't have. She wants to know who the father of her baby is. She wants to know how long I've known about the medical records. She wants to know if anything between us was ever real." "And what did you tell her?" "Nothing. I couldn't. What was I supposed to say? That I knew about my own sterility? That I deliberately deceived her? That I let her believe we had a future when I knew it was all built on lies?" Isla leaned forward slightly, studying his face with the detached interest of a scientist observing a specimen. "You didn't consciously know about your sterility, did you?" The question hit him like a physical blow. David looked up at her, seeing his wife clearly for perhaps the first time in their 8-year marriage. She wasn't just intelligent, she was calculating, strategic, capable of playing a long game that he had never even realized he was part of. "What do you mean?" "I mean, David, that the medical records show you underwent fertility testing 5 years ago when we first started trying for children. But somehow, you conveniently never followed up on the results. Never asked for clarification when the doctor's office called. Never questioned why I suddenly stopped asking about starting a family." Isla's voice carried an odd note of something that might have been pity. "You didn't want to know the truth because it would have interfered with your fantasy of being the virile executive who could have everything." The truth of it was like a knife between his ribs. "Isla, You what? You're sorry? You made a mistake? You never meant for it to go this far?" She stood up, moving to the window with fluid grace. "Save your apologies, David. They're worthless currency now." From the coffee table, she picked up the stack of legal documents and handed them to him. "Divorce papers. Already filed. The settlement is quite generous considering." David scanned the papers with growing amazement. Isla was asking for almost nothing. No alimony, no claim on his business assets, just the apartment and half their joint savings. It was so reasonable it felt like another trap. "This doesn't make sense," he said. "You could take me for everything. The affair, the public humiliation, the what? The betrayal?" Isla's laugh was sharp and bitter. "David, I don't want your money. Money can't buy back 8 years of my life. Money can't restore the trust you destroyed or repair the damage you've done to my ability to believe in another human being." She returned to the sofa, her movements controlled and precise. "What I want is for you to understand the full scope of what you've lost. Not just me, not just your job, not just your little girlfriend. I want you to understand that you've lost the ability to ever be trusted again." David's phone buzzed with another call from Karen. He declined it automatically, but not before Isla noticed. "Still avoiding her calls? She's not handling this well." "Good." Isla's voice was ice cold. 24 years old, pregnant by some unknown man, publicly humiliated in front of her parents, and abandoned by the married man she thought she could steal from his supposedly pregnant wife. Her lips curved into a smile devoid of warmth. She's getting exactly what she deserves. You sound like you hate her. I do. The admission was delivered without hesitation. Karen knew you were married. She knew I was supposedly carrying your child. And she still chose to sneak around behind my back, to mock me, to try to destroy my marriage for her own selfish desires. David looked at his wife, his soon-to-be ex-wife, and realized that her revenge wasn't just about exposing his affair. It was about forcing him to see himself clearly, to understand the collateral damage of his choices. She's been calling Richard Hayes, too, David said quietly, demanding to know if he knew about the medical records, if this was all some elaborate setup. She thinks her own father betrayed her. He didn't betray her. He saved her from making an even bigger fool of herself. Isla's voice carried no sympathy, though I suspect the damage is already irreversible. Protected her? Isla. She's pregnant and alone and doesn't know who the father is. How is that protection? That's not my problem. Isla's response was sharp and final. Karen made her choices when she decided to pursue a married man, when she mocked me to your face, when she thought she could waltz into my life and take what was mine. Her eyes glittered with cold satisfaction. Now she gets to live with the consequences of being exactly the kind of person she chose to be. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 8 years of marriage settling around them like dust. Outside their window, the city continued its relentless pace, indifferent to the small human drama playing out in their expensively furnished living room. What happens now? David asked finally. Now you sign the papers, pack your things, and leave. Isla's voice was firm but not unkind. You find somewhere else to live, look for a new job, and figure out how to rebuild your life without using other people as stepping stones. And Karen? Karen will figure out her own path, or she won't. Isla shrugged with calculated indifference. Either way, it's no longer my concern. She wanted to play adult games with a married man. Now she gets to face adult consequences. David looked around the apartment that had been his home for 5 years, taking in the expensive furniture, the carefully chosen artwork. The life he had built with Isla before ambition and stupidity had poisoned everything good between them. I never meant for any of this to happen, he said. I know. Isla's response was quiet, almost gentle. That's what makes it so tragic, David. You didn't set out to destroy lives. You just did it anyway, one selfish choice at a time. As David stood to gather his things, his phone rang one final time. Karen's name appeared on the screen, but this time he didn't decline the call. Instead, he looked at Isla, who nodded once in what might have been approval or simply resignation. Answer it, she said. Karen deserves at least one honest conversation before you disappear from her life completely. David accepted the call, knowing that whatever came next, whatever pain, whatever consequences, whatever reckoning awaited him, it would be nothing compared to the quiet devastation in his wife's eyes as she watched him finally take responsibility for the ruins he had made of their lives. 3 weeks after the Hayes family dinner, David Collins sat in a cramped studio apartment in Queens, staring at his laptop screen while the sound of sirens echoed through the thin walls. The contrast with his former Upper East Side penthouse was jarring. Second-hand furniture, peeling paint, and the constant smell of Chinese takeout from the restaurant downstairs. This was what rock bottom looked like for a former corporate executive. His phone had been mercifully quiet for the past hour, but he knew it wouldn't last. Karen's calls had become increasingly erratic, swinging between tearful apologies and venomous accusations. Sometimes she begged him to explain how they could fix things. Other times she screamed that she hoped his life fell apart completely. Today marked the 3rd week since she'd learned the truth, and her emotional stability seemed to be deteriorating with each passing day. The laptop screen displayed his email inbox. 17 rejection letters from headhunters and executive recruiters. Word traveled fast in Manhattan's corporate circles, and Richard Hayes had clearly ensured that David's professional reputation was thoroughly destroyed. The official story was philosophical differences about company direction, but everyone in their industry knew the real reason. You don't survive after being caught in a scandal involving the boss's daughter. A knock at the door interrupted his brooding. David assumed it was his landlord demanding this month's rent, money that was already running dangerously low. Instead, he found his sister Rachel standing in the hallway, her expression a mixture of concern and barely contained anger. Rachel, how did you find me? Isla gave me your address. Rachel pushed past him into the apartment, her designer heels clicking against the cracked linoleum. Jesus, David, what have you done to yourself? Rachel was 2 years younger but had always been the responsible one. Married to a surgeon, 2 kids in private school. the kind of stable life that David had once looked down on as boring and conventional. Now her success felt like a reproach to his spectacular failure. "I'm figuring things out," he said defensively. "Are you?" Rachel surveyed the cramped space with obvious distaste. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're hiding from the consequences of your own actions." She sat down on his second-hand couch, pulling out her phone to show him a series of screenshots. "I've been getting calls, David. From friends, from colleagues, from people who've seen the social media posts." David's stomach dropped. "What social media posts?" "Karen Hayes has been busy." Rachel swiped through the images with grim efficiency. "Instagram stories, Facebook posts, Twitter rants. All about how you lied to her, manipulated her, destroyed her life. She's not being subtle about it." The screenshots were devastating. Karen had posted photos of the medical records, lengthy captions describing their affair in explicit detail, and emotional videos of herself crying while talking about betrayal and abandonment. Her Instagram following had exploded to over 50,000 people, all watching the public breakdown of a privileged young woman scorned. "She's getting hundreds of comments," Rachel continued. "People calling you a predator, a liar, a marriage wrecker. Someone even found our family's home address and posted it online." David sank into his chair, the full scope of his social destruction finally becoming clear. "I tried calling her, tried to get her to stop, but she won't listen to me. Maybe because you don't deserve to be listened to." Rachel's voice was sharp with disapproval. "David, you had an affair with a 24-year-old while your wife was supposedly pregnant. What did you think was going to happen when it all came out?" "I thought I could handle it. I thought I was smart enough to manage the situation." "Smart enough?" Rachel laughed bitterly. "You couldn't even figure out that you were sterile. Isla had to hire investigators to uncover medical records that you apparently never bothered to examine yourself." The accusation stung, because it was true. David had gone 8 years of marriage without questioning why he and Isla never conceived, simply assuming that fertility would happen naturally when they were ready. The reality of his condition had been as much a shock to him as it was to Karen. "She knew," David said quietly. "Isla knew everything from the beginning. She orchestrated this entire thing." "Good for her." Rachel's response was immediate and fierce. "Isla is twice the person you deserve, David. She spent 8 years being loyal to a man who repaid her by cheating with someone young enough to be his daughter." David's phone rang. Karen's name appeared on the screen for the 4th time that day. He declined the call, but Rachel had seen the display. "Still avoiding her? What's the point? Every conversation makes things worse. She's spiraling and there's nothing I can do to stop it." "Because you can't give her what she wants," Rachel said bluntly. "She wants you to be the father of her child, but biology says that's impossible. She wants you to leave your wife and marry her, but your wife has already divorced you. She wants the fantasy you sold her, but fantasies don't survive contact with reality." Through the thin walls, David could hear his neighbors arguing about money, their voices carrying the stress of people living paycheck to paycheck. It was a sound he was becoming familiar with, the constant anxiety of financial insecurity, something he had never experienced during his years of corporate success. "I've been thinking about leaving New York," David said suddenly. "Starting over somewhere else, maybe the West Coast. Running away won't change what you've done. It might give Karen a chance to move on. Every time she sees me or hears my name, it just makes her angrier." Rachel studied his face with the analytical precision she'd inherited from their mother. "You're scared of her." The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. "She's unpredictable. The things she posts online, the way she talks about me, it's like she wants to destroy whatever's left of my life." "She does want to destroy you," Rachel said matter-of-factly. "And honestly, David, I don't blame her. You let a 24-year-old girl believe she was going to be your wife, that you were going to leave your marriage for her. You let her get pregnant thinking you were the father. When someone that young gets betrayed that completely, they don't just get sad, they get dangerous." David's laptop chimed with a new email notification. The sender was someone he didn't recognize, but the subject line made his blood run cold. "Seen the news about you and the Hayes girl?" He opened the email to find a link to a blog post titled, "Corporate Executives Affair Exposed, the David Collins Scandal." The article contained everything: photos from Karen's social media, details about the Hayes family dinner, even speculation about David's current financial situation. "It's going viral," Rachel said, reading over his shoulder. "Karen's story is getting picked up by gossip blogs, social media influencers, even some mainstream news outlets. You're becoming famous, David, just not in the way you always imagined." David closed the laptop, unable to look at the comments section where hundreds of strangers were dissecting his personal life with the casual cruelty of internet anonymity. This can't be legal. She's posting private medical information, talking about our relationship. Everything she's posting is either public record or her own personal experience, Rachel said. She's not breaking any laws, she's just telling her side of the story, and her side makes you look like a monster. The irony was suffocating. David had spent months playing elaborate games, thinking he could control narratives and manage outcomes. Now a heartbroken 24-year-old was destroying his reputation with nothing more than social media posts. And the truth. What am I supposed to do? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rachel stood up, gathering her purse and phone. You're supposed to disappear, David. You're supposed to find some corner of the world where no one knows your name, where Karen Hayes can't find you, where Isla doesn't have to see your face and remember what you put her through. She paused at the door, her expression softening slightly. I love you because you're my brother, but I don't like you very much right now. And until you figure out how to be the kind of person who deserves forgiveness, maybe it's better if you stay hidden. After Rachel left, David sat alone in his cramped apartment, listening to the sounds of a city that no longer felt like home. Outside his window, millions of people were living their lives, building relationships, making choices they could be proud of. For the first time since this nightmare began, David understood that some mistakes are so fundamental, so complete in their destruction, that redemption isn't just difficult, it might be impossible. His phone buzzed with another call from Karen. This time he turned the device off completely and sat in the growing darkness, finally accepting that he had become exactly what Isla always knew he was, a man whose lies had grown so large that the truth had nowhere left to hide. The Meridian Tower's executive floor had never felt more like a prison to Richard Hayes. He stood at his corner office window, watching the October rain streak down the glass, while his assistant's voice droned through the intercom with yet another list of crisis management meetings. The scandal surrounding his daughter had been contained within their social circles, but barely. Every day brought new challenges to his carefully maintained corporate image. Mr. Hayes? His assistant's voice carried a note of concern. Your wife is here to see you. She says it's urgent. Martha Hayes entered his office with the purposeful stride of a woman who had spent 30 years managing family crises. Her usually perfect composure showed cracks around the edges, worry lines that no amount of expensive skincare could hide. We need to talk about Karen, she said without preamble. Richard gestured to the sitting area where they had held so many family discussions over the years. How is she today? Worse. Martha's voice was flat with exhaustion. She's been in her room for 3 days, only coming out to post more things online about David. The housekeeper found her crying over pregnancy magazines, talking to the baby about how Daddy abandoned them. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. Have you spoken to Dr. Peterson about increasing her therapy sessions? She won't go anymore. Says therapists are just paid liars who don't understand real pain. Martha sat down heavily, her usual grace abandoned. Richard, I'm scared. Yesterday she showed me a list she'd made of everyone who knew about David's medical condition. She's convinced there was some conspiracy to humiliate her. Was there? The question hung between them like an accusation. Martha studied her husband's face with the practiced eye of someone who had been reading his expressions for 3 decades. Richard Hayes, you knew something was wrong from the beginning, didn't you? Richard moved to his desk, pulling out a thick file folder that had been locked in his private drawer for weeks. I hired a private investigator 6 months ago. The moment I saw how Karen was behaving around David, I knew I needed to understand what I was dealing with. Martha opened the folder, scanning documents that chronicled David's affair in meticulous detail. Bank records showing hotel charges, surveillance photos, even recorded conversations. But what made her stomach turn was the final section, a comprehensive background check on David that included his complete medical history. You knew he was sterile, she said quietly. I've known for 4 months. And you let Karen believe. Martha's voice trailed off as the full scope of her husband's manipulation became clear. You let our daughter make a fool of herself in front of everyone we know. I protected our daughter from making an even bigger mistake, Richard corrected firmly. If I had confronted her directly, she would have run away with him, eloped, maybe moved to another city, certainly cut us out of her life completely. This way, she learned the truth before she could do something irreversible. Martha stared at the photographs of her daughter kissing a married man, her heart breaking for the naive young woman who had thought she was living a romance novel. She's 24, Richard. She's not a child anymore. She was acting like one, Sneaking around with a married man, believing his lies about leaving his wife, planning a future with someone who was using her to advance his career. Richard's voice carried the cold anger of a father who had watched his daughter be manipulated. David Collins saw an opportunity in Karen. Access to wealth, corporate connections, social status. He never loved her. Maybe not. But she loved him. The simple truth of it hit Richard like a physical blow. Whatever David's motivations, Karen's feelings had been genuine. The heartbreak she was experiencing wasn't just about being lied to. It was about having her first real love destroyed by biological impossibility. The baby, Martha said suddenly. Richard, if David isn't the father, then who is? Richard had been dreading this conversation for weeks. The investigator found evidence of other relationships. Karen has been active in her social life. There are at least 3 possible candidates. Martha's face went white. Does she know? She suspects, which is why she's so focused on destroying David. It's easier than facing the reality that she doesn't know who fathered her child. Through the office windows, Manhattan pulsed with its usual energy. Somewhere in that sprawling metropolis, their daughter was alone in her bedroom, crafting social media posts designed to destroy a man who had already lost everything. The futility of her rage was heartbreaking, but Richard understood that Karen needed someone to blame, someone to focus her pain on. David Collins had volunteered for that role the moment he chose to lie to her. There's something else, Richard said reluctantly. Something the investigator discovered about Karen's behavior before she started seeing David. Martha braced herself for another revelation. She's done this before. 3 times in the past 2 years. She's pursued married men. Always older, always successful, always in positions where they could advance her social status. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Martha felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of her daughter. The realization that Karen's affair with David wasn't an isolated mistake, but part of a pattern of destructive choices. I don't understand. We gave her everything. Education, opportunities, financial security. Why would she deliberately target married men? Richard had spent months asking himself the same question. Dr. Peterson thinks it's about control. Karen has never had to compete for anything in her life. But married men represent a challenge, something she has to win rather than something that's simply handed to her. And when she wins, she gets bored and moves on. The investigator found evidence that she was already growing tired of David before the pregnancy happened. The affair was losing its excitement. Martha closed the file folder, unable to look at any more evidence of her daughter's calculated manipulation. So this whole heartbreak, this public breakdown, it's all performance? Not all of it. Richard's voice carried a note of genuine sadness. The pregnancy is real, and her fear about not knowing the father is real. But the devastation over losing David? That's as much about losing the game as it is about losing the man. A knock at the office door interrupted their conversation. Richard's assistant entered with a tablet, her expression grim. Mr. Hayes, you need to see this. Karen posted something new. The tablet displayed Karen's latest Instagram story, a video of her sitting in her childhood bedroom, tears streaming down her face as she held a pregnancy ultrasound image. Her voice was raw with emotion as she spoke directly to the camera. This is my baby, and everyone keeps telling me I need to figure out who the father is, like I'm some kind of, like I did something wrong. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. But here's what no one understands. It doesn't matter who the biological father is. David Collins made promises to me. He told me he loved me. He said we were going to be a family. Karen held up what appeared to be text messages between her and David. These are the lies he told me. About leaving his wife. About starting over together. About how I was the only woman who ever made him feel truly alive. Her voice rose to a near shriek. He made me believe in something beautiful, and then he destroyed it with medical records and lawyers and family dinners designed to humiliate me. The video ended with Karen staring directly into the camera, her green eyes blazing with fury. David Collins, if you're watching this, and I know you are, you need to understand something. You broke me, and broken people do broken things. This isn't over. Martha and Richard watched the video in horrified silence. Their daughter wasn't just having a public breakdown. She was issuing threats. How many followers does she have now? Richard asked quietly. 87,000, his assistant replied. And the video already has 15,000 views. It's being shared across multiple platforms. Martha stood up abruptly, her maternal instincts overriding her shock. I'm going home. She needs professional help, Richard. Not therapy sessions she can skip. Not family conversations she can manipulate. Real help. Martha? No. Her voice carried an authority that Richard rarely heard from his typically accommodating wife. Our daughter is having a public breakdown that's being documented for the entire internet to see. She's making threats against a man who has already lost everything. And somewhere out there is the real father of her baby, watching this spectacle and probably thanking God that he's not involved. As Martha left, Richard remained at his window, watching the rain and wondering how a family that had everything had managed to create such spectacular destruction. Karen's threats against David were troubling, but what worried him more was the growing realization that his daughter's pain wasn't just about losing a man. It was about losing the ability to control her own narrative. For the first time in his corporate career, Richard Hayes encountered a crisis that couldn't be managed with money, influence, or careful planning. His daughter was spiraling into a darkness that no amount of privilege could illuminate, and the man she was determined to destroy had already fallen so far that there was nothing left for her to take. But broken people, as Karen had said, do broken things. And Richard was beginning to understand that his daughter's version of broken might be more dangerous than anyone had realized. 6 months after the Hayes family dinner, Isla Collins stood in the marble-floored lobby of Meridian Tower. Her reflection multiplied infinitely in the polished surfaces around her. She wore a tailored navy suit that spoke of quiet confidence and professional success, a far cry from the supposedly fragile pregnant wife she had pretended to be for so many months. The elevator ride to the 47th floor felt like ascending to a throne she had earned through patience, strategy, and an understanding of human nature that had proven devastatingly accurate. Today's meeting would be the final piece of her carefully orchestrated revenge, the moment when David's former colleagues learned exactly what kind of woman they had underestimated. Mrs. Collins, or should I say, Ms. Sterling now? Richard Hayes stood as she entered the executive conference room, his smile genuine for the first time since she had known him. Thank you for accepting our proposal. Isla had legally returned to her maiden name, shedding the last vestige of her marriage like a snake discarding old skin. The decision felt liberating in ways she hadn't expected. Not just freedom from David, but freedom from the person she had been when she carried his name. The pleasure is mine, Mr. Hayes. Isla took her seat at the head of the conference table, the same table where David had once sat during weekly strategy meetings. I've reviewed the consulting contract, and I believe there's significant potential for improvement in your crisis management protocols. The irony was exquisite. Meridian Tech had hired Isla as their new director of corporate communications and crisis management, the company David had worked for now paying his ex-wife a salary higher than his former position, specifically because of her expertise in managing the exact type of scandal that had destroyed his career. Your handling of your own situation was remarkably sophisticated, said Jennifer Walsh, the company's chief legal officer. The way you controlled information flow, managed public perception, and minimized corporate exposure was textbook crisis management. Isla accepted the compliment with the calm dignity of someone who had earned every word of praise. Over the past 6 months, while David had spiraled into obscurity and Karen had publicly self-destructed, Isla had quietly rebuilt her life with surgical precision. I had excellent motivation to succeed, Isla replied simply. Through the conference room windows, Manhattan sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. Somewhere in that vast city, David was working a customer service job at an electronics store in Brooklyn, his MBA and executive experience worthless in a market where his name had become synonymous with corporate scandal. The job paid barely enough to cover his studio apartment rent, but it was the only employment he could find after Karen's social media campaign had made him unemployable in any respectable position. Speaking of your former husband, Richard said carefully, we wanted you to know that the company has officially terminated all non-disclosure agreements related to his employment here. If you choose to discuss his conduct publicly, Meridian will not interfere. Isla smiled, an expression that held no warmth, only satisfaction. That won't be necessary, Mr. Hayes. David is destroying himself quite efficiently without my assistance. It was true. The latest reports from the private investigator Isla still employed painted a picture of complete social and professional collapse. David had gained weight, developed a drinking problem, and isolated himself from friends and family who had grown tired of his self-pity and excuses. His sister Rachel had cut off contact entirely after he asked her for money for the 3rd time. And your daughter? Isla's voice carried polite interest, nothing more. How is she adapting to motherhood? Richard's expression darkened slightly. Karen gave birth 2 months ago, a healthy baby girl, the paternity test. He paused, clearly uncomfortable. It confirmed what we suspected. David was not the father. How unfortunate for her. Isla's tone suggested she found it anything but unfortunate. Karen Hayes had given birth to a daughter whose father turned out to be Marcus Webb, a married attorney she had been seeing concurrently with David. Marcus had promptly filed for divorce from his own wife and proposed to Karen, but the damage to her reputation was irreversible. Her social media following had turned against her when the truth emerged, that she had been simultaneously manipulating multiple married men, lying about paternity, and destroying families for entertainment. The final blow had come when Marcus's ex-wife released recordings of phone conversations, where Karen bragged about her ability to seduce married men and destroy their families. The recordings went viral, transforming Karen from a sympathetic victim into a widely despised predator. Even her former friends had abandoned her, unwilling to associate with someone whose hobby was breaking up marriages. She struggled with the adjustment, Richard admitted. The social isolation has been challenging. Isla felt no sympathy. Karen had made her choices when she decided to mock a supposedly pregnant woman and pursue her husband with such cruelty. Now she was learning that actions have consequences, even for privileged young women who had never faced adversity. I'm sure she'll adapt, Isla said dismissively. Young people are remarkably resilient. The meeting continued with discussions of corporate strategy and crisis protocols, but Isla's mind wandered to the life she had built from the ashes of her marriage. Her consulting firm now employed 12 people and counted Fortune 500 companies among its clients. She had purchased a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, larger and more expensive than the home she had shared with David. Most importantly, she had discovered talents and capabilities she had never known she possessed. There is one final matter, Richard said as the meeting concluded. David has been calling our offices repeatedly, asking for references for job applications. Our HR department wanted guidance on how to respond. Isla gathered her documents with practiced efficiency. I would recommend complete honesty, Mr. Hayes. Tell potential employers exactly what kind of employee David Collins was. His strengths, his weaknesses, and his tendency to make catastrophically poor personal decisions that affect his professional judgment. It was a death sentence for David's career prospects, delivered with surgical precision and perfect reasonableness. No lies, no malicious fabrications, just the truth, which was devastating enough on its own. As Isla left the Meridian building, she reflected on the past year with the satisfaction of someone who had played a complex game and won decisively. David had lost his marriage, his career, his social standing, and his future prospects. Karen had lost her reputation, her social circle, and her sense of invulnerability. Both had learned that manipulating other people comes with costs they had never imagined. But Isla's victory wasn't just about their destruction. It was about her own transformation. She had discovered that she was stronger, smarter, and more capable than anyone had given her credit for, including herself. The woman who had pretended to be a naive, trusting wife for 8 years had emerged as someone formidable enough to rebuild her entire life, while systematically dismantling the lives of those who had betrayed her. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Melody. "Dinner tonight? I want to hear about the new job." Isla smiled as she typed her response. "Absolutely. I have wonderful news to share." She did have wonderful news. Her ex-husband was working retail and drinking himself into oblivion. His former mistress was a social pariah raising a child whose father wanted nothing to do with either of them long-term. And Isla Sterling, the name felt powerful now, like an identity she had earned rather than inherited, was walking into a future where every success would be a reminder that the best revenge isn't getting even. The best revenge is living well, while watching your enemies destroy themselves with the very character flaws that led them to betray you in the first place. As Isla stepped into her hired car, she realized that David and Karen had given her the greatest gift possible. They had taught her exactly how strong she could be when people underestimated her. Now, as she watched Manhattan flow past her window, Isla understood that her real life was just beginning. And unlike David and Karen, she intended to build it on a foundation of truth, calculation, and the hard-earned wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal and choosing to become someone better rather than someone bitter. The war was over, and there had never been any doubt about who would win. 1 year after the divorce was finalized, fate orchestrated the kind of encounter that feels designed by cosmic justice. Isla Sterling stood in line at Dean and DeLuca on Madison Avenue, waiting to order her usual Friday morning coffee before heading to her corner office at Sterling Crisis Management. She had grown accustomed to the small luxuries that success afforded: artisanal coffee, designer suits, the quiet satisfaction of a life rebuilt on her own terms. She noticed him before he saw her. David Collins, 30 pounds heavier and wearing the rumpled uniform of a Best Buy employee, stood behind the electronics store counter visible through the cafe's window. His once sharp executive appearance had been replaced by the defeated posture of a man who had learned exactly how far someone could fall when their lies finally caught up with them. When their eyes met through the glass, David's face cycled through shock, recognition, and something that might have been shame. Isla simply nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, nothing more. She had no interest in conversation, confrontation, or closure. David Collins was a chapter of her life that had ended, and she felt no need to revisit old pages. But David apparently felt differently. As she settled into a window seat with her coffee and laptop, he appeared at her table, still wearing his Best Buy name tag like a scarlet letter, advertising his professional downfall. Isla. His voice was hoarse, aged beyond his years. Could I talk to you for a minute? She looked up from her laptop screen with the polite disinterest she might show a stranger asking for directions. I have a conference call in 10 minutes, David. Make it brief. He sat down without being invited, a presumption that irritated her, but didn't surprise her. Even in his diminished state, David still carried traces of the entitlement that had led to his destruction. I've been wanting to apologize, he said, his hands fidgeting with a paper napkin. For everything. For the affair, for the lies, for... David. Isla's voice cut through his rambling with surgical precision. I don't want your apology. I never wanted your apology. What happened between us is finished, and your guilt is not my responsibility to absolve. The words hit him like physical blows. But I need you to know that I realize how wrong I was, how much I hurt you. You need me to know. Isla's laugh was sharp and humorless. You need me to know that you've finally figured out what everyone else understood from the beginning? That actions have consequences? That lying destroys trust? That betraying your spouse might result in losing everything you value? She leaned forward slightly, and David found himself recoiling from the cold intelligence in her eyes. David, your epiphanies are irrelevant to me. Your growth as a person is irrelevant to me. Your current circumstances, your regrets, your desperate desire for absolution, all irrelevant. Through the cafe window, she could see other Best Buy employees preparing for their shift. David's coworkers were mostly young people, recent college graduates who probably wondered what had led a middle-aged man with an MBA to be working retail alongside them. The humiliation of that daily reminder must be excruciating for someone who had once commanded corner offices and seven-figure budgets. I lost everything, David said quietly, as if she hadn't already calculated the exact scope of his destruction. Yes, you did, and you lost it through a series of choices that revealed exactly who you really are. Isla's tone remained conversational, almost pleasant. You chose to have an affair with a woman young enough to be your daughter. You chose to lie to both your wife and your mistress. You chose to believe you were clever enough to manage a double life indefinitely. She took a sip of her coffee, savoring both the taste and the moment. Most importantly, David, you chose to underestimate the woman you married. That may have been your most costly mistake of all. The pregnancy, the medical records, the way you orchestrated everything. David's voice carried a note of grudging admiration mixed with fear. I never knew you were capable of that level of planning. Neither did I, Isla admitted. You taught me capabilities I never knew I possessed. In a way, I should thank you. Discovering that I could dismantle two lives with nothing but patience and truth was remarkably empowering. David flinched at the casual cruelty of her words. Karen had a baby. Did you know that? I know everything about Karen Hayes, David. I know the baby wasn't yours. I know she's raising it alone because Marcus Webb decided that a woman who destroys marriages for entertainment isn't suitable wife material after all. I know she's been trying to rehabilitate her public image through social media posts about single motherhood, but the internet has a long memory for predators who target married men. The comprehensive nature of Isla's knowledge was terrifying. David realized that his ex-wife had been monitoring his life, Karen's life, and the aftermath of their scandal with the dedication of a scientist studying a particularly interesting experiment. She asks about you sometimes, David lied, hoping to provoke some reaction. Some sign that Isla still carried anger or hurt that could be manipulated. No, she doesn't. Isla's response was immediate and certain. Karen Hayes has never asked about me because I was never real to her. I was just an obstacle to be removed, a problem to be solved. She couldn't conceive of me as an actual person with thoughts, feelings, or the ability to fight back. She closed her laptop with deliberate precision, which brings us to the lesson you both learned too late. The people you think are weak, naive, or easily manipulated might surprise you. The quiet wife might be gathering evidence. The trusting spouse might be 3 steps ahead of your lies. The woman you dismiss as simple might be the architect of your destruction. David's phone buzzed with a text from his manager asking where he was. His break was over, and he needed to return to helping customers choose between competing smartphone models, a job that paid him in 8 hours what he used to earn in 30 minutes. "I have to go," he said, standing with obvious reluctance. "Yes, you do." Isla opened her laptop again, already dismissing him from her attention. "David, before you leave, let me give you one final piece of advice. Stop trying to contact me. Stop asking for references from former colleagues, and stop telling people that what happened to you was unfair or undeserved." She looked up at him with eyes that held no warmth, no forgiveness, and no remaining connection to the woman who had once loved him. "You are exactly where you belong, living exactly the life your choices earned you. Accept it, with whatever dignity you have left." As David walked back to his retail job, Isla returned to her conference call preparation. Through her laptop screen, she could see the agenda for her afternoon meeting with a pharmaceutical company facing a sexual harassment scandal. The irony wasn't lost on her. She now made a very comfortable living helping corporations manage the exact type of crisis that David's behavior had created. Her phone rang with the conference call. "Sterling Crisis Management, this is Isla." The voice on the other end belonged to a Fortune 500 CEO whose company was hemorrhaging stock value due to executive misconduct. As Isla began outlining her strategic recommendations, she felt the deep satisfaction that came from having transformed personal destruction into professional expertise. Outside the cafe window, Manhattan continued its relentless pace. Somewhere in that sprawling metropolis, Karen Hayes was probably dealing with a crying baby, while scrolling through social media comments calling her a homewrecker. David was explaining extended warranties to customers who earned more money than he did. Both were living with the permanent consequences of choices they had made when they thought they were smarter than everyone around them. But Isla Sterling was building something lasting from the ashes of her old life. She had discovered that revenge wasn't about destruction, it was about transformation. The best way to defeat people who try to break you isn't to break them back. It's to become so successful, so powerful, so completely beyond their reach that their very existence becomes irrelevant to your happiness. As she ended her call and prepared to return to her office, Isla realized that she no longer thought about David and Karen as people who had wronged her. They had become cautionary tales she sometimes shared with clients. Examples of what happens when people believe their lies are more powerful than the truth, when they think their victims are too weak to fight back, when they confuse temporary success with permanent victory. The woman who had once pretended to be pregnant to gather evidence against her cheating husband had evolved into someone far more dangerous, a person who understood that the most devastating revenge is living so well that your enemies become footnotes in the story of your success. And as Isla walked back to her corner office, leaving David to his cash register and Karen to her isolation, she understood that some victories are so complete, so total, that they don't require celebration. They simply require you to keep living, keep succeeding, and keep being everything your enemies said you could never become. The war was over. It had been over the moment David underestimated the woman he married. Everything since then had just been the inevitable playing out of consequences he had set in motion the day he chose betrayal over loyalty, lies over truth, and temporary pleasure over permanent happiness. Some people learn those lessons before it's too late. Others become object lessons for those wise enough to pay attention. David Collins and Karen Hayes had chosen their category, and Isla Sterling had chosen hers. 5 years later, the auditorium at Columbia Business School buzzed with the energy of 300 ambitious graduate students, each one believing they possessed the intelligence and drive necessary to conquer the corporate world. At the podium, Isla Sterling commanded the room with the quiet authority of someone who had learned her lessons not from textbooks, but from surviving the kind of betrayal that destroys weaker people. "Trust," she said, her voice carrying easily to the back rows, "is the only currency that matters in business, and once broken, it can never be fully restored." She clicked to the next slide of her presentation. Case study: when personal decisions destroy professional careers. The students leaned forward, sensing that this wouldn't be another dry academic exercise but something far more viscous and real. 5 years ago, a senior executive at a Fortune 500 technology company made a series of personal choices that seemed, to him, completely separate from his professional life. He believed he could compartmentalize his decisions, manage multiple relationships, and control outcomes through manipulation and lies. The slide changed to show a generic corporate organizational chart. This executive was intelligent, well-educated, and had spent years building what appeared to be a successful career. But he made one critical error in judgment. He underestimated the people around him. Isla paused, scanning the faces of her audience. These young people were the same age Karen Hayes had been when she decided that destroying a marriage would be an entertaining challenge. They possessed the same dangerous combination of intelligence and inexperience that made them believe they were immune to consequences. Within 18 months, this executive had lost his career, his family, his social standing, and his financial security. Not because of corporate restructuring, market forces, or economic downturns, but because his personal choices revealed character flaws that made him unemployable in any position requiring trust or judgment. A student in the front row raised her hand. Was he breaking any laws? Could the company legally fire him for personal conduct? An excellent question, Isla replied. The executive wasn't charged with any crimes, but employment law allows companies significant latitude when personal conduct affects workplace dynamics, client relationships, or corporate reputation. More importantly, this case illustrates that legal protection and professional survival are entirely different things. She clicked to the next slide. The ripple effect of betrayal. The executive's choices didn't just destroy his own life. His affair partner, a young woman who believed she was entitled to whatever she wanted regardless of who got hurt, found herself pregnant and abandoned when the truth emerged. Her public breakdown became a cautionary tale about the consequences of treating other people's lives as entertainment. Isla had followed Karen's trajectory with the detached interest of a researcher studying a particularly predictable outcome. The young woman had tried repeatedly to rehabilitate her public image. Mommy blogger posts, charity work, even a short-lived podcast about learning from mistakes. But the internet never forgets, and Karen Hayes remained unemployable in any professional capacity. Her trust fund provided financial security, but money couldn't buy back respectability. What happened to the wife? Another student asked. Isla smiled, the first genuine warmth she had shown during the presentation. The wife discovered that she was far stronger and more capable than anyone had given her credit for. She used the crisis as an opportunity to completely rebuild her life on her own terms. It was true. Sterling Crisis Management now employed 43 people across 3 offices. Isla's client list included Fortune 100 companies, political campaigns, and celebrity publicists. She had been profiled in Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and the Wall Street Journal. The woman who had once pretended to be pregnant to gather evidence against her cheating husband was now regularly quoted as an expert on corporate crisis management and reputation rehabilitation. The most important lesson from this case study, Isla continued, is that character matters more than competence. Technical skills can be taught, experience can be gained, but fundamental integrity, or the lack thereof, reveals itself under pressure. She clicked to her final slide. Questions for consideration. As you build your careers, ask yourselves, are your personal choices consistent with your professional aspirations? Do you treat people as obstacles to be manipulated or as human beings deserving of respect? When you make decisions, do you consider only immediate gratification or long-term consequences? The questions hung in the air as students scribbled notes, many of them probably thinking about their own relationships, their own choices, their own capacity for both creation and destruction. The executive in our case study believed he was smart enough to manage competing loyalties and hidden relationships. He thought he could control outcomes through careful planning and strategic deception. What he failed to understand is that the people we think are powerless often possess capabilities we never see coming. After her presentation, Isla walked across Columbia's campus, breathing in the crisp autumn air. Her phone buzzed with messages from her assistant, 3 new client inquiries, confirmation for next week's board meeting, and a request for an interview from a documentary filmmaker studying corporate scandals. She paused at the campus coffee shop, the same chain where she had once encountered David for the last time. Through the window, she could see young people laughing, studying, planning futures they believed they could control through intelligence and ambition alone. Some of them would succeed. Others would make the same mistakes David and Karen had made, learning too late that actions have consequences and character has costs. Her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar. Brooklyn, where David had moved after losing his apartment in Manhattan. She declined the call without hesitation. 5 years had passed since their divorce, and David occasionally still tried to contact her, sometimes for references he would never receive, sometimes for forgiveness she would never grant, sometimes simply because his loneliness had become unbearable. Isla felt no curiosity about his current circumstances. The private investigator she retained provided quarterly reports that painted a picture of steady decline, job losses, financial struggles, health problems, and the kind of social isolation that comes from being a cautionary tale rather than a success story. Karen's attempts at contact had ceased years ago, but Isla still monitored her social media presence with professional interest. The young woman who had once commanded 60,000 Instagram followers now posted to an audience of fewer than 300, mostly family members, and a handful of other social pariahs who had made similar life choices. Her recent posts focused on her daughter, a beautiful child who would someday learn exactly how her conception had destroyed multiple families. As Isla walked to her car, she reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought her to this point. The woman who had been betrayed had become stronger than the people who betrayed her. The victim had transformed into someone who helped others survive their own crises. The supposedly naive wife had evolved into someone whose professional expertise was built on understanding exactly how people destroy themselves when they believe their lies are more powerful than the truth. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Melody. "Saw your lecture streaming online. So proud of you. Dinner this weekend?" Isla smiled as she typed her response. "Absolutely. I have good news to share." The good news was both professional and personal. Sterling Crisis Management had just been acquired by a multinational consulting firm for a sum that would secure her financial independence for life. But more importantly, she had proven to herself that strength could be built from betrayal, that wisdom could emerge from pain, and that the best revenge wasn't destruction, it was transcendence. As she drove through Manhattan toward her penthouse apartment, Isla passed the electronics store where David had worked during his lowest point. The location had been converted into a trendy restaurant, as if the universe itself was erasing evidence of his presence from the city where he had once thought himself important. Karen's family had moved to California years ago, seeking distance from the scandal that had made their daughter's name synonymous with predatory behavior. Richard Hayes had quietly retired early, selling Meridian Tech to avoid any remaining association with the corporate drama his daughter had created. But Isla Sterling had remained, building something lasting from the ashes of her former life. She had learned that the most powerful revenge isn't making your enemies suffer, it's making their existence irrelevant to your happiness. The city lights stretched endlessly in all directions as Isla reached her building. Somewhere in that vast expanse, people were making choices that would define their futures, choosing loyalty over betrayal, truth over convenience, integrity over temporary advantage. Others were making the opposite choices, setting in motion consequences they couldn't yet imagine. As she stepped into her elevator, Isla understood that her story had become something larger than personal vengeance. It had become proof that underestimating people is dangerous, that actions have costs, and that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who understands exactly how to win. The woman who had once pretended to be pregnant to catch a cheating husband was now someone whose name carried weight in boardrooms across the country. The supposedly naive wife had evolved into someone whose expertise was sought by powerful people facing their own moments of crisis. And somewhere in the night, David Collins and Karen Hayes were living with the permanent consequences of the day they decided that a woman's love, trust, and dignity were things that could be taken without payment. They had learned, too late, that some debts come due with interest that compounds for a lifetime. Isla Sterling had collected everything they owed, with dividends they never saw coming. The elevator reached the penthouse floor, and Isla stepped into a life she had built entirely on her own terms. A life where every success was a reminder that the best victories are the ones where your enemies become footnotes in the story of your triumph. Some wars end with surrender, others end with irrelevance. This one had ended with both. The end. Isla Sterling proved that perfect revenge isn't about making your enemies suffer. It's about becoming so powerful that their existence becomes irrelevant to your happiness. David works in an electronics store. Karen raises a son alone as a social outcast. Isla runs a corporate empire and lectures at elite universities. Justice has been served. Cold, permanent, perfect. If you discovered that someone close to you was deliberately destroying your life through lies and betrayal, what would your true reaction be? To seek immediate and explosive confrontation, or to have the cold patience to orchestrate revenge so complete that your enemies would destroy themselves with their own choices? This story offers no easy answers, just the hard truth about what happens when people think they can manipulate others without consequences.